A synthetic vitamin was added to a common food. It became part of the daily routine. The effects of this change took years to become visible. This was not an isolated event. This wasn't presented as an experiment. It was presented as progress. The rationale seemed straightforward at the time. Rickets, a bone-softening disease caused by vitamin D deficiency, had been a genuine problem in crowded industrial cities where children rarely saw direct sunlight. Fortification appeared to solve it, and in the narrow measure of rickets prevention, it did. But the practice didn't stop when rickets became rare. It continued, it expanded, and it became so routine that asking why milk needed fortification would have seemed as strange as asking why bread came sliced. The process had been normalized not through debate, but through repetition. It blended into everyday life. Grocery stores stocked it, pediatricians recommended it, school cafeterias served it. The fortification was never temporary, it was permanent, embedded into the infrastructure of food production itself. Most people didn't question it. They had no reason to. The government had endorsed it, nutritionists supported it, and the companies producing the milk benefited from a product that could now be marketed as healthier, as enhanced, as scientifically improved. There was no public conversation about whether fortification should remain once rickets had nearly disappeared. There was no discussion about whether synthetic vitamins behaved the same way in the body as sunlight-derived vitamin D. These questions weren't suppressed, they simply weren't asked. This wasn't discussed openly. The transition happened without controversy, without resistance, and without most people even noticing a change had occurred. That's how normalization works, not through force, but through the quiet accumulation of unchanged routines. The mechanism behind fortification was straightforward. Vitamin D2, typically derived from irradiated yeast, or vitamin D3, often sourced from lanolin in sheep's wool, was added to milk during processing. The doses were standardized. The process was regulated. On paper, it was simple. A deficiency existed, a solution was introduced, and a disease was prevented. What wasn't considered as carefully was what happens when an entire population begins receiving a daily dose of a fat-soluble vitamin through a single food source, regardless of individual need, geographic location, or natural sunlight exposure. The real impact appeared years later, not in the form of rickets returning, but in patterns that were harder to trace. By the 1990s and early 2000s, researchers began noticing something unusual. Despite widespread fortification, vitamin D deficiency was being diagnosed more frequently, not less. Blood tests revealed that many people, even those drinking fortified milk daily, had levels that fell below what was considered adequate. The fortification had become a baseline assumption in public health, yet it wasn't delivering the outcomes it had been designed to achieve. At the same time, new research began exploring the broader roles of vitamin D in the body. It wasn't just about bones. Vitamin D receptors were found in nearly every tissue. Immune function, cell growth, mood regulation, all appeared to involve vitamin D in ways that hadn't been understood in 1968. And crucially, researchers began to differentiate between vitamin D obtained from sunlight and vitamin D consumed through fortified foods or supplements. The pathways weren't identical. The body's regulation of vitamin D produced in the skin involved feedback mechanisms that didn't apply to vitamin D ingested orally. By the time these findings began to accumulate, the infrastructure was already locked in. Milk processors had built fortification into their production lines. Dietary guidelines had been written around the assumption that fortified milk was a primary source of vitamin D. Generations had grown up with the idea that milk was inherently tied to vitamin D, even though, historically, it wasn't. The fortification had become invisible, woven so tightly into food culture that separating the two seemed impossible. What's important to understand is that this wasn't a conspiracy. No one set out to harm anyone. The scientists and policymakers who implemented fortification in the 1960s were working with the best information they had. But the system they created was never designed to be reevaluated. It was designed to be permanent. And once a practice becomes permanent, questioning it requires confronting not just the practice itself, but the entire framework that supports it. There were other consequences that took longer to recognize. Fortified milk became a recommended staple for children, especially in school meal programs. But not all children metabolize vitamin D the same way. Skin tone, for instance, significantly affects how efficiently the body produces vitamin D from sunlight. Darker skin requires more sun exposure to generate the same amount of vitamin D as lighter skin. Yet, the fortification levels in milk were standardized, one size fits all, without accounting for these differences. The assumption was that fortification would equalize access. In practice, it may have obscured the reality that some populations were receiving inadequate amounts, while others were consuming levels that exceeded necessity. And then there's the question of what fortification replaced. Before vitamin D was added to milk, people obtained it primarily through sunlight and, to a lesser extent, through foods like fatty fish and egg yolks. The fortification gave the appearance of solving the problem nutritionally, which may have reduced the perceived urgency of ensuring children spent time outdoors. It created a technological substitute for a biological process. And once that substitute was in place, the cultural behaviors that had previously supported vitamin D production, outdoor play, less indoor sedentary time, became easier to erode without anyone noticing the trade-off. By the time the internet age arrived, discussions about vitamin D had shifted almost entirely to supplementation. People debated dosages, forms, and testing. The fortification itself was rarely mentioned. It had become background noise, an unexamined given. But the original justification, preventing rickets, had ceased to be relevant decades earlier. Rickets cases in the United States had become statistically rare by the 1970s, yet the fortification continued, not because the need persisted, but because the system had no mechanism for stopping. What's particularly striking is how little public input was involved. The decision to fortify milk wasn't put to a vote. It wasn't debated in town halls. It was made by agencies, endorsed by expert panels, and implemented by industry. The public's role was to consume, and consume they did, largely unaware that a significant alteration had been made to one of the most basic foods in the American diet. This is the part that most people never think about. Fortification didn't just add a vitamin, it changed the relationship between people and their food. It introduced the idea that food, in its natural state, was insufficient, that it needed to be enhanced, corrected, improved by industrial processes. Milk was no longer just milk, it was a delivery vehicle. And once that precedent was set, it became easier to apply the same logic elsewhere. Breakfast cereals, bread, flour, orange juice. The fortification of the food supply expanded, and with it, the belief that intervention was not just helpful, but necessary. The system wasn't designed to be questioned, it was designed to scale, and it did. Fortification became a model for addressing nutritional deficiencies globally, exported to other countries, embedded in international health programs. The success was measured in the eradication of deficiency diseases, not in the long-term effects of populations consuming synthetically enhanced foods for decades without interruption. Maybe you remember being told that milk was essential, that without it, bones wouldn't grow strong, that it was something every child needed. That belief wasn't accidental. It was reinforced through education, through advertising, through government recommendations. And woven into that belief, invisibly, was the fortification. The vitamin D wasn't optional. It came with the milk, and the milk, you were told, wasn't optional either. What wasn't explained was that this version of milk, the fortified kind, had only existed for a few decades. That generations before had consumed milk without added vitamins and had not experienced widespread skeletal collapse. That the need for fortification was context-dependent, tied to specific environmental and social conditions that had changed over time. These nuances didn't make it into the public messaging. What made it into the messaging was simpler. Milk is healthy. Drink more of it. The consequences of this weren't immediate. They unfolded slowly across generations. Patterns of behavior shifted. Outdoor time decreased, reliance on processed and fortified foods increased, and the baseline understanding of what constituted normal, healthy eating drifted further from anything that had existed before industrialization. None of this was the result of fortification alone, but fortification was part of the architecture. It was one piece of a larger system that prioritized efficiency, scalability, and intervention over observation, adaptation, and respect for biological complexity. By the 2010s, some researchers began to ask whether fortification had outlived its usefulness, whether it made sense to continue adding vitamin D to milk when most people could obtain it more effectively through brief sun exposure or targeted supplementation based on individual need. These questions didn't gain much traction. The infrastructure was too entrenched, the economic interests too significant, and the public too accustomed to fortified milk to imagine an alternative. The milk fortification program was never rolled back. It was never reevaluated in a comprehensive, public way. It simply continued. And it continues now, more than 50 years after its introduction, serving a population with different health challenges, different lifestyles, and different nutritional needs than the one it was designed for. This isn't about whether fortification was right or wrong in 1968. It's about what happens when a temporary intervention becomes a permanent feature of the food system without ongoing scrutiny. It's about the gap between the justification for a policy and the reality of its long-term implementation. And it's about how easily the public can be excluded from decisions that affect what they eat, how they eat, and what they're told about their own health. The fortification of milk was part of a broader shift, a shift toward viewing food as a problem to be solved rather than a relationship to be understood, toward standardization over variability, toward intervention over observation. And once that shift occurred, it became the foundation for dozens of other changes that followed. Similar decisions followed, and each one, like the fortification of milk, was introduced with the best intentions, adopted without broad public input, and left in place long after the original problem had faded. That pattern didn't stop there.